Hey everybody, welcome back to Practically Platonic. Today we will be talking about the last chapter in the second book of the Enneads, which is titled in our edition Against the Gnostics. In this chapter is quite long, and Plotinus goes through a myriad of points in which he disagrees with the Gnostics. But something I want to point out before I hand over to Jeff is that for him, this wasn't merely a debate, a philosophical debate with just another point of view of a different school. But I get the feeling, and the editor of this edition also points out that he felt it sort of a moral imperative on his part to argue against them and clarify what he thought was the truth from falsities that he thought they were presenting to the public, that he thought were actually noxious for society and for people's individual well-being. So I'll hand it over to Jeff, and we'll go over just a summary of some of the topics, and then we can get into some of the details and have a further discussion on our thoughts and how this might apply still.
Right.
Jeff?
Thanks so much. This is a very long chapter, as you said, and there's a lot of very interesting points. But Plotinus starts off with an overview of his own cosmology. And so he points out that there's one intellect, not many. So that's an important point of Neoplatonic cosmology, especially as he has formulated it. He also discusses how the soul is threefold. So there's the undescended intellect, the faculty of discursive thinking, and the faculties of sense perception and growth. So clearly this is in response to his opponents, which he, in this chapter, goes into great detail criticizing. He also briefly mentions the intelligibles, and he emphasizes that they're not generated in the sense of coming and passing away. This is another important part of his cosmology that he wants to emphasize at the beginning. He goes into the discussion of a fallen world. So this is one of the ideas proposed by his proponents, clearly. He says, "We are, for our part, say that it's not an act of declining, but rather it's not declining that accounts for the producing. If it did decline, the producing is due to its having forgotten the things in the intelligible world. But if it forgot, how does it create? So the creation of the world is only possible if the soul maintains some kind of undescended connection to the forms." So this idea that souls would be somehow detached from the higher metaphysical reality, detached from the forms, creates all sorts of issues for Plotinus. So the soul has to make right.
So I'm sorry, you mean that the concept of a fallen world is a concept of the proponents of Gnosticism, not his Neoplatonism, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clarify because it was a little unclear.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
He also says that for if it has any memory whatsoever, why wouldn't it be wanting to go back? For what could it be thinking to gain for itself by producing the cosmos? And so here he's talking about the world soul and the descent of the souls. So again, if the souls were really entirely fallen and detached from this higher metaphysical reality, then what would it be recollecting, and why would it be what would it gain? What would the soul ever gain from having created a cosmos? And so he's initially critiquing this idea of the fallen world. So the Gnostics basically believed in this idea of a flawed creation. And I should emphasize, according to my readings, that there's more than one form of Gnosticism. It was kind of a diverse school of thought. But in this case, we're dealing with what Plotinus was critiquing. So the Gnostics believed in a flawed creation. So it's not a perfect world created by a single God, which stands in contrast to how Plotinus frames the one being the source of generation for the intelligibles, the soul, and the material world. But Gnostics believe that the world was created by a lesser, very flawed divine being, which is often labeled as the demiurge. So as we'll recall, the demiurge in Plato, particularly in Timaeus, has a role of being a creator god. And so the Gnostics also will use this term demiurge. But this was an ignorant being, or malicious. And then there's this imprisoned divine spark. So humans, they weren't really created in God's image, but rather they're a spark of the true divine trapped within the material world. And this spark functions as a sort of source for our yearning for something beyond the physical. So they're trying to escape material reality, because material reality is a trap, and it's a trap created by the demiurge, and it's a very flawed and corrupt place. It's a realm of suffering, ignorance, and it's keeping us from realizing the divine spark. So it's very much anti-material. So Plotinus goes on to critique their cosmology. What I found interesting is that he evokes the stars in his discussions and also the planets. So he points out the sun is more orderly than we are, but his proponents would deny this because they believe that the soul is immortal and divine, but the stars are not part of an immortal soul. So recall from earlier chapters, Plotinus does talk about how there are these celestial bodies above, and they're also ensouled beings. So the stars and the planets and so forth are ensouled beings. So the Gnostics famously have this idea that all the stars and planets are evil. So that would be problematic for Plotinus because he sees a divine order in the movements of the planets and the stars. Plotinus also later remarks in this chapter that heavenly bodies, in fact, provide order and ornament to the cosmos. So in fact, they're not evil, and that they're good and necessary. So the Gnostics talk about this concept of a new earth, but it's not like a literal place, but it's a express principle of the cosmos, which seems to be their idea of the logos. Plotinus says that the Gnostics drew some material from Plato, but they really innovated many new things, a new brand of philosophy. He's very serious about this critique. He doesn't appreciate that the Gnostics have appropriated vocabulary and ideas from Plato and misrepresented them or taken them into erroneous directions. Plotinus, he says, there are no hard feelings if they tell us in which respects they intend to disagree with Plato, but they shouldn't promote their own ideas to their audiences by disparaging and insulting the Greeks. So he has some very serious critiques against them, which he, for many pages, goes on to elaborate on. So one other thing that I found interesting in this was this idea that they have a different definition of the demiurge, as I was saying. So Plotinus says, and how does this demiurge, which has just come to exist, set to work? But its memory of what it had been, but neither it nor the mother that they granted to it existed at all prior to their generation. They would have had to exist in order to have seen anything. So this also led me to wonder about Timaeus, where there is this idea of the demiurge initiating the creation of the cosmos, but the demiurge in Timaeus presumably is uncreated and doesn't have a time preceding them when they didn't exist. So there's a sort of like atemporality, but the Gnostics have this conception that a demiurge comes to exist at a certain point in time and then is responsible for creating the material world that we're trapped in. So again, it's very complicated material, and you can see that Plotinus is very severely criticizing them. And it's interesting that his whole critique was also included in this book. So clearly his disciples, Porphyry and so forth, believed that this was an important chapter to include. And then finally, there's also some discussion of how they view diseases. So the Gnostics had this idea that the diseases are daimons, and that the Gnostics claimed to be able to exorcise them with words, so presumably some form of magic or incantations. So this was another issue that he took with another issue he had against them. So overall, I thought this was an interesting chapter. It's challenging, and it also stands as a way to contrast everything we've read so far against a position held by his contemporary opponents. So what's your opinion on this, Sylvia?
I quite like this chapter. It is long, and it's not necessarily much longer than other chapters we've read, but he does say a lot of things and seems to go topic by topic through and disagree with them. But it's often a disagreement on their logic, and often just a disagreement on even a starting point. But I think he does make good arguments against their logic, specifically in saying, well, based on what we've read here, I'd have to go and really read what the text he was referring to is, because we have to take into consideration again that this was a human and he had his own biases and surely was using rhetoric to some degree to make his argument. But that he says that they seem to be contradictory in the way they present their ideas, and that if we live in a fallen world in which we can't, not that which created us is illusory and evil, that we are so far removed from being able to have a notion of truth, yet they, the Gnostics, are able somehow to have gotten, this gotten this information or reached these conclusions, which he, I think, from a very pragmatic point of view, sees as concerning in a kind of the way that people can use this for power, or the kind of cult-like aspects that has of, some chosen people who, for unexplainable reasons, have access to information that no one else can have access to. And I think he makes a good point in where he says that they haven't really come up with their own argument on things. They're simply dissecting erroneously or ignorantly the works of Plato, but aren't really coming up with their own ideas. And the ideas that they do present, they don't really, at least from what we've read here, he says they're not really making a logical argument to how they've reached those conclusions about the demiurge, etc., right? Because even his ideas or Plato's, it's not like they're conclusions that are made from empirically, but they are still rationalistic. There is a syllogistic logical structure in the way they come to their conclusions, which he seems to be saying these guys don't even have that. I just wanted to go back on some of the points that you brought up about the fallen world theory. If we backtrack just a little bit, he comes to the conclusion that this is erroneous based on the conception of the soul, and he makes a differentiation. He talks about what the soul, in the embodied soul, the individual soul is, and that has kind of three parts, as has already been discussed in previous books. I feel like him discussing it here makes it a little clearer than when he's just discussing it in general, where the three parts, even though they're all connected, but the kind of the three levels, I don't know how else to explain it, of the soul that in us, for example, is the first level is the disembodied soul, which is not influenced by the body. And then there is the lowest part is that which kind of, I almost seems like, to me, the spark that makes us like living beings, makes us like the autonomic aspects of actually being animated and living, and all the aspects that are the more base parts of us that need to function. And then in the middle between these two is our ability to have discursive thought, in which the higher soul interacts with this body, so that we are able to have, I guess, what we would consider the rational or intellectual aspect of being a human being. And he differentiates this from the world soul, which he says, and he also says that our soul, or aspects of our soul, are kind of trapped by the body, whereas this is not at all the kind of relationship that the world soul has with the universe. Unlike us, where to some degree where we have to constantly fight with, or I guess we're in a sort of dilemma with our body, where our body often controls our perception of the soul in the here and now. The soul of the universe is actually what is controlling the body of the universe, which is, I think, by that he means the actual physical universe, and that the universe is really just an image or an illumination of the world soul, and that the world soul is not differentiated like we are. He also talks a little bit about the difference between our ability to think, like, I am thinking this is a cell phone. But if I stop and think about the fact that I'm thinking about this being a cell phone, there is kind of the aspect of self-awareness, which he disagrees with Aristotle, that those are two different consciousnesses. It is one conscious, but it is two different actions as experienced by humans. Whereas for the world soul, both the emanation, the thinking, and the thinking of itself, like self-awareness, is all one act. It is constantly thinking of itself while thinking all the things that it emanates, because there is nothing beyond it. And therefore, it is part of the intelligible realm. And all of this to say that when he argues against the fallen world theory, if he believes that there is a universal soul that is in the intelligible realm, why would it have fallen? And what I think is the most interesting thing that he brings up is that for something to fall, it needs to exist within linear time. But for there to have been something that is eternal, it can't have fallen. It would have always have been falling, so that there would be nothing before falling. So this would have been the only state. There can be no falling outside of time, which I think is kind of a good argument against the Gnostics' idea that at some point something fell out of a higher reality that was outside of time. Because if I'm understanding correctly, the demiurge is a result of something from higher up, even though it's a corruption. Though that part then I find confusing, because he also does say it's kind of from or their idea is that it's also from nothing, but how can something come from nothing and be fallen? And there he also makes another good argument within the confines of what he's presented in his book, that how could the demiurge create anything in the material world if it's come from nothing? And here he's referring back to, I want to say the Timaeus, but maybe also, the Timaeus, Plato's idea that everything's a recollection. So if the demiurge created this broken world, he still had to create it based on something. And if he comes from nothingness, he has no memory. So he wouldn't have been able to create it based on anything. But in reality, there is something, so he must be creating it based on something. And he, I think, makes the argument that it's the recollection, at the very least, of the intelligible realm, and that it is the image of the intelligible realm. And tied to this, he also I thought it was kind of funny how he's constantly kind of pointing out how to him these Gnostics seem like very negative Nancy's, kind of buzzkill, doomy kind of people that seem to have high expectations that are too high without any solutions, the kind of people who just complain but don't present anything productive. And he brings up the fact that he thinks it's also not realistic on their part to expect the world to be super perfect, because it's an image of the intelligible. It is not the intelligible itself. And that he thinks that just because aspects of this reality are disagreeable to us, that doesn't make them inherently evil or fallen. And he poses the question of, okay, please tell me how you think things could be better. I think, and by asking that question, he's pointing out that these Gnostics very rarely, if ever, at least the ones he's talking about, really give any productive philosophy to their followers, which is what this whole book is really about. It's about, and what the philosophical life, I think he believes, should be. It should be about bettering yourself, whatever the circumstances, and living a just life within the conception of philosophy, whereas they are only picking everything apart, I guess, and have some sort of, I guess they believe in some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Revelatory ability to become aware that there's something beyond this, but that's not very useful in day-to-day life and doesn't really give people tools to have autonomy and accountability. So I thought that was interesting. There's obviously a lot of parallels with a lot of Christian views of different denominations and at different points in the history of Christianity, to more or less a degree. Of course, what we know of Gnosticism is that it was often a mixture of, or a bastardization, depending who you ask, of messianic concepts that were that had been, not coming out of, this is already a little later, but that had become popular at the time, mixed with previous Hellenic thought, and certainly a representation of the identity crisis of the time. I think a lot of messianic or fallen world sort of religions or thought processes, either spiritually or even empirically or in the mundane world, like our own era, come from periods of identity crisis, economic crisis, instability, but all of these things mixed together. When everything becomes unstable, people collectively start questioning the identity of their society. And I think that leads to things like this. So
Right.
It gets so much stuff. I mean, we could spend hours talking about all the arguments he makes, but I think the main one is arguing against fundamentally what they seem to think is that the universe is evil and that the creator of the universe is evil. He also at some point points out that that the demiurge that they speak of is kind of like sentient in a way similar to the way a human being, or that we can conceive of sentience, whereas the one is beyond this. It's not self-thinking in the way that we think of ourselves. It doesn't have the kind of motivations that they seem to give to the demiurge, such as, and he also brings up, like, well, what's the point of, like, the repentance that if you come to have this knowledge like the Gnostics seem to have, why did any of this happen? What is their point of the repentance? And what is it that you're supposed to do? He kind of thinks that the whole concept that the demiurge did this to, like, glorify himself is ridiculous, because why would something that is superior to everything else need to do something like that? He kind of just picks apart the reasons they attribute to this happening, which now that I'm thinking about it, is similar to the way that Plato may have picked apart the Homeric idea of the gods by attributing to them the kind of faults and motivations that human beings may have. Because when you really stop and think about it, it's quite absurd that something so beyond us would have those kinds of motivations. There's no reason to, as far as we can even conceive, or based on the structure we've given to what we think might be the reality of these entities, right? And I like how positive he is. I mean, I think all of his theories and philosophy are really very positive, but that he thinks that the universe is a good place, and that he ends up also talking about beauty and goodness. And I don't recall now off the top of my head why he brings this up. I'm sure there's a connection in argumentation with something they're saying, but he thinks that he brings up the idea that beauty, anything that's beautiful, is actually good. This is kind of, I guess, this is just a point that I thought was interesting, even relative to the way we think about things now, or maybe psychological truths now. I can't remember how it connects back to which argument he's making against the Gnostics, but basically that and he brings up people, like beautiful people are beautiful on the inside, and the beauty on the inside is what makes them beautiful externally. And he says, and he brings up the fact that there are sometimes people who may appear to be physically beautiful externally, but they're ugly on the inside. And he says, well, those people are not actually beautiful. It is an illusion that we think that they're beautiful. And sometimes we come to realize that they are not beautiful once we interact with them. Or he also makes the concession that maybe there are people, and this was a part that I thought was most interesting, people who appear to be ugly on the inside and beautiful on the outside, but perhaps they're not actually ugly on the inside. But he says something to the effect that the circumstances and the obstacles in their life have caused them to appear to be ugly. And I think that's a very true psychological statement of a lot of people, about people not necessarily being inherently evil, but the result of things that may have happened to them in childhood or life trauma that shapes us and rewires us mentally in a way that we start having a destructive behaviors. But if we become aware of this, there is a way to fix that, or to rewire ourselves so that we become better people again, and quit destructive habits, right? I thought that was a very forward thinking thing for him to acknowledge, that people's circumstances can make them do bad things, and not seeing the world in such a dynamic of sin and goodness, and that nobody is redeemable on their own. At least that's what I took away from it. That's like near the end. But yeah, so those are my thoughts on some of the things that you talked about.
Yeah, so one thing that you have brought to my mind is, in the earlier chapters, we read that according to Plotinus, matter is an evil, but it's an evil only so far as it is the source of our vices, because we have a mistaken perception toward.
Well, it's a privation, and then we have a mistaken, yeah, it's a lack of something which we then mistakenly interact with, in a sense, right?
Right. There's a belief, for example, that something material is good, worthwhile pursuing, and that's inevitably the source of many of our vices, such as, excessive appetite, lust, violence, dishonesty, and so forth, because we believe, for example, just as an example, that, for example, acquiring physical property or wealth is worth sacrificing our moral character or our virtue. So, for example, to lie, to cheat, to exercise aggression toward other people in an unjust way in order to acquire physical things. But that being said, at an ontological level, matter is the inevitable expression of the soul, and the soul is an inevitable expression of the intelligible realm, which is an inevitable expression of the one. So by virtue of that, you can't say that there's any sort of specific design coming from above that would force or compel matter to be evil. It's not in the design that matter is privation and really a source of evil.
Right. The conception of the Gnostics seems to be completely different. They seem to think of evil as a positivist thing versus the negation that it is from a Platonic point of view. I may be wrong about that, but in that sense, these two schools of thought are approaching the concept of ethics or evil from a completely different point of view. but they're not really making a great argument for their conception of evil, at least what's presented here.
Right. I mean, you can tell that Plotinus is also going back to first principles, and he doesn't have any sort of tolerance for revelation, as you were pointing out. So, although of course Plato is a source of inspiration, it's not revelation, because the idea is that Plato was full of myths, but you can use arguments, inference, dialectics, and so forth in order to determine some sort of truth to these myths. It's not that the myths have to be taken literally. It's not that the demiurge is in Timaeus is a literal intelligent god who decides one day to create the cosmos. No, it's you have to.
Right, and Plato says as much in the Timaeus. He's like, here's a story. It's as close to what I can imagine being the truth, but he also frames it purposefully within the dynamics of myth, because he knows that's something people can grasp.
Right. And I think one of the implications too is that if you view matter in a healthy way, as Plotinus would suggest that you do, then you'll be freed from a lot of tendencies toward vice, because you won't view matter as worth pursuing. You'll just view it as just a necessity of the cosmos, but it being privation and being something that's really not a source of good, or being an inferior image of the soul, then it's in your best interest to turn away from it. But that's basically a rational argument. It's not a moral argument, and it's certainly not connected to an idea that there is a malevolent deity who created this and you're trapped in material world. So in that sense, I suppose that Plotinus is sort of dealing more from a rational point of view, whereas the Gnostics are coming at it more from like I guess you could say, religious or, even myth-based point of view.
A very more extreme kind of point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the chapter, he kind of wraps it up by talking about what you're talking about, that how to, I guess, interact with the concept of evil, or the fact that we're embodied. And yes, this is not the most ideal form for the soul, but yet here we are. And he says, since he does not believe that the soul of the universe is evil, or that the universe is evil, and he thinks the celestial, and he makes his argument as to why the celestial entities are not evil, but actually good, and in some way superior to us because of their perfection and simplicity. He says we should orient ourselves, or try to in some way mimic them in the world soul as it interacts with its body, by not by trying to flee our body, but simply by being unfazed by the body that we are in, and try to always, or the things he's already said, to orient ourselves toward the virtues, and that we should imitate the world soul in that way, instead of trying to evade all of this.
Right. So it's all about perspective. It's not necessarily action so much as orientation. So it's not that there's some sort of ritual you have to perform, or some sort of incantation you have to recite, but rather it's basically a mental orientation. And then from that proper mental orientation comes a healthy interaction with matter, a proper mind that's oriented towards something that's superior to matter, and then you work your way back up to the intelligible realm, and ideally to the one, and then from that leads to wisdom and some sort of, I guess you could say, liberation even. At least my sense of reading Plotinus so far is that the end goal of this is not just an understanding of some sort of higher reality, but basically liberation. So you'll live life better, and you'll suffer less as a result of this if you have the right orientation. So he's coming at it from a very different point of view than the Gnostics. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying, that's something that actually becomes rather influential in the history of religion, that the perspective towards the stars and the planets. So for Plotinus, there's a sort of perfect order to the movements of the heavenly bodies, because it's predictable, it's simple, it's straightforward, it doesn't deviate. Whereas the material world, so in different religions, there's been different approaches to the stars and the planets. So for the Platonists and for Plotinus, the planets and the heavenly bodies and their ordering represents basically orderliness, even like perfected ordering, because they don't deviate from their movements and their simplicity. Whereas at the material world, we see all sorts of chaos and all sorts of unpredictable behaviors and movements and so forth, not even just living beings, but also, for example, weather patterns and natural disasters and so forth. So The Gnostics, on the other hand, they viewed the planets and the stars all as somehow evil. And as Plotinus alludes to in this discussion as well, that they don't see them as the sort of in-soul divinities as Plato did. And so in other religions, moving later into Antiquity, for example, Manichaeism, they had this similar perspective that the planets and the stars were evil. Zoroastrians viewed the planets as evil because they go retrograde, so their movements will go backward, whereas the fixed stars remain forward in motion. And so there's sort of been this complex relationship with what exactly the stars and the planets are, especially because a lot of people in Antiquity, not just the Platonists, also viewed the stars and the planets as divinities. So, for example, in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, they also viewed the planets and the stars as gods and goddesses. So most famously, for example, you have Surya and Chandra, the sun and the moon god in India. And so there's sort of a complex relationship with them. But the fact that Plotinus is constantly or frequently evoking the nature of the stars and so forth is sort of like an admonishment towards the Gnostics, I think, to suggest that they reevaluate their perspective. Because from his perspective, Plotinus's perspective, this sort of perfect ordering of motion that you have when you look up into the stars ought to invoke some sort of sense of appreciation, especially if you view them as some sort of intelligence, which is what most people did in Antiquity. They didn't view them as insentient sources of light or, as physical bodies in the sky. They viewed them as intelligences, which is something that we can trace back to Plato, of course. So I thought that was interesting.
I also think that he makes an interesting comment therein, how the Gnostics kind of prioritize, in his mind, I guess, in a kind of closed-minded manner, prioritize the way humans are conscious and making that seem like superior to the way that the planets or the spheres exist. Whereas he gives, like you said, primacy to their eternity, the simplicity, and the perfection of their functioning, and not so much whether or not they appear to think in the same manner we do. And near the end of the chapter, he does point out that the Gnostics think they're so great because once they leave the body, they can escape this reality. But he thinks that they have a misunderstanding of what the outside is and how the world soul or the universal soul actually interacts with things that are quote unquote soulless, such as the spheres, that they actually have such a much more harmonious relationship with the soul versus our physical bodies. And therefore, in that sense, they're much more perfect. This makes me think, and I may be misattributing what he's trying to say, but what it made me think is also of very modern ways in which we've started thinking of the earth from even a scientific way and even just a mundane ethical way, how we started thinking of the earth as a living being versus just an amalgamation of living things but dead itself. And also how in like animal rights, for example, how there's a tendency toward orienting the rights of things or the sanctity of things, whether or not spiritually or just secularly, not so much tied to how similar they are to the way humans are conscious or not, but in the right in which they are they are existing and they are harmonious within their own system, if you see what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, his argument for why the spheres and really like the wider nature, the world itself, the earth, all of these things are deserving of respect and in some way more divine than individual humans is very avant-garde for even people of that time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, it's also for Plotinus, it's not so much that you are trying to escape reality, but rather that you have a proper perspective toward it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what his whole point is just have a good perspective. Look at the universe, look at the harmony of the universe and try to mimic that. Don't have such a problematic relationship with your existence, but rather try to orient yourself always toward the virtues so that you can live the best way possible while you're here. Much like animals, like we say this is something that's brought up in different cultures, maybe cultures that in modernity are closer to nature, but to live in harmony with things. It's not that wild animals don't have a tough life, right? They certainly do in many ways, way harder than we do. But to live in harmony with the situations that you find yourself in versus constantly being in an intellectual or an emotional turmoil with them, which can in humans lead toward things like violence and depression and obsessive thinking. So in this way, much like we may see in individual animals, we can attribute to the spheres and that they're living in harmony. They're living in the moment, in the perfection of what is, and not in battling themselves against it. Of course, it's a different relationship because they are in a more harmonious state with the world soul than we are with our embodied soul, but still to at least strive for that.
That brings to mind this idea of escape. So, I mean, as far as I know, animals don't have this conception that there's something better than their current incarnation, their current embodiment, and that they
You mean
somehow
like metaphysically, or like just their actual positioning to? Do you mean just like in a wider sense, or like that
well,
they
like
can
for
escape to a
example,
safer spot?
for example, in a spiritual sense, like
Okay.
if we do a comparison with early Buddhism, there's this idea of samsara, which is cyclic existence, reincarnation, rebirth, and it's involuntary. And so the problem that the Buddha proposed was that you have this life that will eventually end, and then you'll be reborn, and you can be reborn as an animal, you can be reborn as a god, you can be reborn in various human circumstances depending on your karma. So your past actions, whether you were good or bad, whether you were destructive or helpful to other people. And so your karma comes to fruition when you die, and then you go into a new incarnation. But the Buddhists proposed that you're somehow able to escape this cycle of samsara, and if you do, you achieve what's called nirvana, which is extinction, cessation. And so what it means is that effectively your mental continuity is no longer reborn. You're no longer engaged with reality. What exactly happens after nirvana is, a bit of an open question, but it's clearly that you're no longer involved in samsara, and you won't be reborn ever again. So but my point here is that there's a moral position that, well, you as a being who has suffered so much is entitled to something better than what you got, that there is an escape from this reality, and that you ought to pursue it. Whereas for a lot of polytheist cultures historically, there was no sense of that there is a better reality out there, whether you can, escape this present reality or not, but rather from a polytheist point of view, the gods created the world the way it is, and that there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's not a erroneous creation, warts and all that we have to go through. It's still basically a product of the gods, and we should ideally have some sort of sense of gratitude for living in this world. And so that goes back to my earlier point, where I wonder if any animal has a sense of like, well, I'm entitled to something better than a life of being an embodied being and having to suffer and eat and get old and die and sickness and death and so forth, and losing those I love and so forth. But humans will inevitably come up with these different conceptions of like, well, why am I suffering? And maybe I shouldn't have to suffer. And then
Well, that
maybe
is a
there's something better than
major question that I think humans have always had. We certainly have now, or that we think is what differentiates us from animals. This level of self-awareness and these abstract thoughts, right? And maybe who knows? I certainly don't know. Maybe animals aren't aware. Maybe animals know more than we do. Maybe they're more aligned with the one, or whatever you want to call it, with the true nature of reality. I think this sort of topic is really something that I think people think about a lot, and has been through different periods of society thought of, like in the Middle Ages, the ethics of animals, if they were like actually more evil than us in a sense, or soulless or not. This whole, the wider topic, I think, is one of the big topics of how we think we differentiate ourselves from them, and one in which different kind of world cultures also actually see animals as wiser and more connected with the divine than us. It really just, but we don't know. I don't think, if there's no empirical evidence, we don't have very much information really on how animals, there is studies in this area, but they only in the last like maybe 40, 50 years have we really started thinking about things and studying them in more depth. But yeah, definitely. It's a very interesting question.
Right. And so I guess the point that I'm getting to here is that, for the Gnostics, there is an escape, and you have a moral imperative to pursue that. Right. Whereas for Plotinus, it's not really an escape from reality, but it's having a proper perspective on reality. And then the
Yeah.
result of that is that you'll have less vice and you'll suffer less and you'll be a better person. And that in itself is a worthy pursuit. And ideally
He
at some
makes,
sort of, yeah.
go ahead.
And then maybe maybe in the long term, there is a sort of, spiritual ascension, and that, when you do pass away, your soul is freed from a lot of the bonds which would otherwise, restrict and compel you back into a disagreeable material existence. But for the time being, in your present lifetime, you do have the ability to transcend vice and to be a better person. And one of the results of that, the fruits of that, will just inevitably be that you'll just lead a happier life. And happier in the sense of not like, of course, this isn't meaning like hedonism and fame and fortune and so forth, but just being mentally content and stable. And that in itself
Right.
is its own reward.
He has a metaphor near the end of the chapter. I think his last 2 points are kind of, in his opinion, pointing out what we've just discussed, but also kind of what he thinks is the hypocrisy of these Gnostics. He makes the metaphor that the Platonists versus the Gnostics are like two people living in the same house, and one of the two people is complaining constantly about the structure of the house and how it's awful, and the stones and the boards are all lifeless, and it's not really a true abode. And they're just going on and on complaining about it, but they continue to live in the house and maybe even secretly enjoying it. Whereas the other person, and the one I just described would have been the Gnostic. So complaining but doing nothing about it, except basically, I guess, having a less pleasant experience of existence, really.
Mm-hmm.
And even potentially being hypocritical about it, because they may be speaking these things but secretly enjoying it. And then the other person who just accepts that this is what he has and it tries to enjoy his home the best he can. And his other point is, I think, probably, I feel that this is also true of at least some versions, certainly earlier Christianity, but where he thinks it's hypocritical that they refer to even like the random person as their brothers, yet think that the sun and the moon and the rest of the universe are evil, that the universe is evil. And how can you call these people your brothers and try to have a connection with them when they too are embodied beings, if you despise the entirety of the universe?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a clear contradiction there between feeling a connection with the other when everything in this reality, according to them, is evil and an illusion and bad.
Right. So it's, so it's they're being very selective about who they want to have affinity with, whereas it would make more sense to attempt to have affinity with perfectly ordered heavenly bodies such as the sun and the moon, or
right,
to
but if
respect their wisdom.
Right, but I think that the point he's making is, if those things are, in their opinion, are evil, the universe, we ourselves are beings on one of these planets. We are also material, and therefore he just thinks it's a complete contradiction, because you can't have it both ways. You can't pretend to actually feel a connection with individuals here, because we're not just disembodied souls off to wherever the Gnostics think we can escape to. We're in the here and now, and we're part of this universe, whether or not they like it. So it's a cognitive dissonance to see the world both ways. And I think the unspoken thing there is also the hypocrisy and the manipulativeness of this kind of behavior from a group of people who is trying to get people to be sympathetic to them, right? It's like, but at the end, not Plato, but Plotinus is consistent with everything else he said, that the important thing is to just be aware of the nature of what it means to be in this material world while we're here, and to make the best of it in a virtuous manner. Like, again, as you said, not through escape, because even hedonism is escape. It's an even more illusory escape, but through trying to live our lives in the most virtuous manner possible. And also, he makes a point at one point near the end, which I really like, where not about the Gnostics, where we should not be putting down others and thinking that we're better and constantly be speaking down on others, but realize, he makes a point that he says everyone is trying, or most people are trying, to live their best life, just like you are, and to not put yourself on a pedestal as if you have deeper knowledge of everything but to just basically just like that everyone, is fighting their own battle, as people say nowadays, which I thought was a very human and psychologically avant-garde, and a
Right.
very compassionate thing to say. And that is in comparison to the kind of, I guess, I don't know what term to use.
It's
The way the Gnostics
basically
are.
it's an argument against basically a privileged elect
Yes.
having
Yes,
revelation or
exactly. It's an
being
argument against the
custodians.
privileged elect podium that the Gnostics and Christianity, and I guess a lot of the Abrahamic religions, put themselves upon.
Right. It's if you found your philosophy or your religion, your thinking on revelation, then only some people are privy to that revelation, and some people
Right.
have to position themselves as custodians of it. Whereas with
Exactly.
Platonism, in theory, anybody who contemplates these things can have access to the same wisdom that Plato did. And
Right.
Plotinus doesn't claim himself to somehow be a custodian of secret wisdom.
No.
It has to be protected. But this sort of brings to mind too how, like, in the modern day, there's a lot of ideas that are still present that are similar to Gnosticism. Like, there's a lot of people, for example, who believe that the present world will eventually, and maybe even soon, face the apocalypse. Not that,
Right. I
not
mean,
not the
Gnosticism is
nuclear
still.
wars, right? Not the
I
nuclear
mean,
wars
all
going
of
to
this
break
stuff
out.
never went away. I think all the Abrahamic because it's a product of that time. Most of that is what's actually survived as a kind of fallen world concept of reality.
Hmm. Yeah. So there's
Whether
this
or
the
not you
idea of,
believe, whether or not people are Abrahamic or not, even atheists in contemporary society in the West, even if they may not believe in God or Christianity or Islam or Judaism, thousands of years of their social background is still, and their socialization is based on a certain kind of worldview of the world sucks, we're bad things are going to happen, and either there is no escaping it when you die, there is nothingness, or even within just while we're alive, all these terrible kind of, I think where you're going with this, all these terrible things are going to happen because we're bad and everything's bad and everything we've done is bad and everything's just screwed up.
and there's also among some atheists, you see them saying that, we have a responsibility to protect the planet and wildlife and the environment and so forth. And that sort of thinking basically positions humanity as the chosen species, that because we have
Exactly.
an elevated intellect and sense of reason and opposable thumbs and the development of technology and so forth, that we're basically some sort of anomaly in nature, but there's a sort of teleology there. But by virtue of this anomalous evolution that gave us big brains and opposable thumbs and so forth, that we ought to exercise this for the benefit of the
Right.
planet.
And in that sense, they certainly are pretty much in agreement, in a sense, with the Gnostics as far as the inferiority of the planets and everything in the universe, in which they're all maybe not evil, but dead and like lifeless, soulless, and that humans are supreme, as conscious entities, if not soul-ensouled entities. I mean,
Right.
they will make the argument that we caused a lot of the problems, fair enough, but that means that you also believe that there is nothing beyond us and that we control everything and we must right all our wrongs, and that there isn't perhaps a bigger order beyond us,
Right.
and that
Right.
that our behaviors are really not that significant, or not that they're not necessarily significant, but we are not the ones dictating the fate of reality.
Right. Right. But then if you take a perspective of, atheist positivistic
Well, I'm saying I'm
materialism,
talking about it
yeah,
from an atheistic point of view. That's what some are fundamentally saying, because they think that there is no fate beyond the destiny man makes for himself, because everything else is dead and lifeless, and there's only us while we're alive,
right.
and
So
therefore we're superior.
but then there's also the argument of, like, although you only have one life to live and you're only conscious so far as your brain is working, that collectively as a species that we have a sort
Right.
of moral obligation to do certain things. But that's, I guess you could argue that like a collective moral obligation to, for example, preserve the planet and preserve species and also spread the species out into space in order to protect us from eventual extinction, et cetera, et cetera. But again, that's largely founded on, I suppose you could say, self-interest. That
Of course
basic
it is.
that
I mean, now we're entering into the realm of the fact that they don't believe there's anything more relevant than being alive, because they're not really interested in and even the ethics, it's just about suffering while we're alive. I mean, there's a point at which you can't really make a comparison anymore because they don't believe in anything else. Whereas in Platonism, the ultimate point is not about really having like a great life now, or there are some like civic duties while we're here within society, but ultimately it is our soul that matters. But an atheist doesn't believe in the soul.
Mm-hmm.
So all there is they are completely focused from a Platonic point of view. They are completely focused on the illusion of material. And in that sense, they're deviating also from the Gnostic perspective. What they share with the Gnostics is kind of a negativistic view of the world, or not negativistic, but a negative, pessimistic view of reality.
Right. And it's also, I guess you could say that from like an atheist material point of view, that the human body is an encumbrance that we inevitably have to deal with, but inevitably hedonism, or at least how do you say, minimizing suffering as much as physical suffering as much as possible, and maximizing physical pleasure becomes, I suppose,
it's Epicurean to a certain point it's Epicurean to a degree, or like, I guess the more virtuous of the atheists might be Epicurean.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and not that there's anything wrong with wanting to take care of nature or preserve things. I don't think that's what we're saying. I don't think we're saying we should behave destructively with nature. I think it's more about the assumption or the assertion that we are so primary to everything in reality, right?
Right. From a materialist atheist point of view in the present day, like agency is entirely down to humanity. And then you get these ideas that we're going to start to control the weather, and that we'll somehow be able to make amends for, past centuries of carbon emissions, and that technology that we create ourselves, that we engineer,
right.
will save
but there's
us
a
from
point
the
at which we
consequences of our
can't there's a point where we can't continue to make a comparison, because the Enlightenment and the disenchantment of the world, and the point in which, quote unquote, God died in the 16 and 1700s, is what catapulted us into the very quick technological development we're in, and the kind of ethics we used or lack now in the development of those things. If society had continued with a religious or even any kind of spiritual reality as being still a true reality, things would probably be different, or at least the way we would rationalize things would be different. There was a point in which our notion of what exists or not, that being God or anything beyond this material world, changed so radically that I think everything after it is kind of is a result of that. The technologies we have, the way they've developed, and the way we think about them could not be the way they are if people or if society wasn't fundamentally atheistic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a point where we can't really make a comparison of like, well, how would Neoplatonist or the Platonic society, or even a Christian society that had never, reached the Enlightenment or reached the spiritual aspect of the Enlightenment, how would they have dealt with these things? We can maybe guess at it a little bit, but we can't know, because that's not what happened.
Right. I mean, that's a very deep question of like, so what if other civilizations in the past had developed empirical science, and as a consequence of that,
well, they had to a degree.
Well, yes,
they did have empirical science. It just got to the real point of change was where empirical science became the only methodology that was seen as truth, and everything else was not. I think,
right.
And science and technology are not the same thing necessarily. One is a result of the other, but they're not the same, and we got to remember that. I think the issues are like the use of technologies.
Well, it's also the application
and our
of
positioning. Yeah, the application of technology.
The application of technology, which led to the Industrial Revolution, which led to also an agricultural revolution that allowed for a large segment of the population to no longer be engaged in agriculture and manual labor.
But ultimately, all of this, the application of technology, consciously or subconsciously, collectively, is a commentary on, once the idea of the meaning of life being oriented towards something metaphysical disappeared, whatever form it had, in different parts of the world. In the moment in which all that exists is the material world, what is the purpose of our life? And I think that is why technology developed the way it is. It is the answer that society without a God and without anything beyond this material world gave itself, if you think about it.
Well,
You see what I'm saying?
let me cite an example from my own observations. So, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, they still have, particularly in the Himalayas, very large monasteries that are funded by the community, supported by the community, and a large number of young men and young women go there to become monks and nuns. And historically, Tibetan Buddhist societies in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan plateau were interested primarily in funding these sort of religious institutions. And the community as a whole felt that this was worthwhile because you'll produce, enlightened people, wise people. There'll be a continuity of knowledge of past generations, that this is inherently good, not just for society, but for the individuals involved as well. And this sort of conception of the world arguably still continues today in many Himalayan communities, where, as far as I've ever experienced, I mean, there's occasionally somebody who says, like, maybe we should send our children to engineering school and become, engineers, or to study biology and so forth. But rather, there's a sense that actually it's a good thing that people devote their lives to this religious lifestyle and this sort of spirituality. And so that is kind of the opposite of where the Western world went, where, as you said, there's only one truth, and that's empirically verifiable material reality. There's one methodology that is true, which is the scientific method, and everything else is either fantasy or just outright false. And then as a result of that, so that's why we have massive amounts of resources in the West that's directed towards science and technology, because it's a belief that this will make our world and our lives better. And even, for example,
it's not just that, it's now the ultimate goal of humanity is only reachable, whatever it may be. And even that is completely relativistic. Everything's become relativistic. And whatever, even like the highest, and I'm not saying, I don't think that science wouldn't have existed or technologies wouldn't have existed. They would have just had a more limited function in reality, in society. Whereas now, where before people would have continued to use philosophy or religion, revelation, whatever, as the explanation of, the ultimate goal of and reason behind the human condition, whereas now science is supposed to find the ultimate truth of reality and the ultimate goal of the human condition. And what are those goals around? They're around, one of the major things it seems to be around is, since they think that there is nothing beyond life, is eternal, like living forever, the continued existence of a consciousness that they are not even that they don't believe has an existence beyond the material. I think fundamentally in search of whatever truth they think might be out there, because they've negated that any of these previous ideas of reality exist. Therefore, they're on a mission to find out what the material reason of reality is. But I don't know. I think at the bottom of even that, I think there's a hope of something else, because if everything is explainable just in this material realm and can be something that can be conceived by humans, I think fundamentally there's something more that they're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's also
beyond that.
There's always been a deep interest in trying to determine how the universe even comes to exist. So the Big Bang.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm talking about.
Mainstream.
Where the universe is from, what created the universe.
Right. And vehement challenges and opposition to concepts of intelligent design, even ones that are not necessarily biblical in orientation.
Right. I mean, I think Platonism has an intelligent design in a sense. They're just not biblical. It's not a God that's like sentient in a way that's similar to humans. It's completely, it's more of a force of nature, or a force of beyond nature, right?
Yeah.
Anyways.
Inevitable result.
Right.
Well, we can conclude this here, and we will continue our discussion in the next episode. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. Next time we're starting the third book. We're getting through it.
We're getting
All
there.
Right.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.